For most of the late 20th century, the relationship between Libya and the United States was defined by hostility. While many European nations maintained varying levels of engagement with Gaddafi, even through the turbulent 1990s, the United States took a far harder line. Diplomatic relations had been severed since 1980, and Libya remained on the US list of state sponsors of terrorism for over 2 decades. But time and necessity began to change the equation. In 1991, the Gulf War sent a powerful shockwave through the Arab world. As American tanks rolled into Iraq and Saddam Hussein's hold on power began to collapse, another leader watched with growing unease, the person of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Like Saddam, Gaddafi was a dictator presiding over vast oil reserves, widely detested by the West, and dangerously isolated on the world stage. To Gaddafi, the message was unmistakable. A similar fate could easily await him. His regime had already been battered by international sanctions following Libya's alleged involvement in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. As a result, his most urgent mission became clear: survival. And survival, he realized, would now depend on something he had long resisted: friendship with the West. Subsequently, Gaddafi began to cut ties with international terrorist groups, expelling notorious Palestinian militant leaders who had enjoyed Libyan hospitality since 1985. Additionally, the Libyan leader, in 1999, acknowledged general responsibility for the 1984 shooting of British police officer Yvonne Fletcher outside the Libyan embassy in London. He offered compensation to her family and the victims of the Lockerbie bombing, paving the way for the restoration of diplomatic ties with Britain after a 15-year rupture. Relations between Libya and the US reached peak progress after the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Within days of the attacks, Gaddafi issued a rare and public condemnation of the perpetrators. He even volunteered to donate blood from Libya for the victims and emphasized later on that the US invasion of Afghanistan was fully justified. This was a stark departure from the anti-American rhetoric that had once defined his foreign policy. In 2003, Gaddafi stunned the world by announcing that Libya would dismantle its weapons of mass destruction program and wage no more wars or acts of terrorism. You see, that year, the United States had invaded Iraq on the basis that Saddam Hussein possessed WMDs. Whether the invasion directly prompted Gaddafi to reconsider is still debated. His son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, led the public relations effort and presented the decision in modest, practical terms. Libya, he said, would be safer without nuclear weapons. Following this, the US lifted its travel ban on Libya, and in 2006, the State Department officially removed Libya from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Economically, the results were immediate. US investment in Libya soared to $4 billion in 2004, 6 times what it had been just a year earlier. For the first time in decades, Washington and Tripoli were talking, trading, and cooperating. Libya became a target for American oil companies and investors. But even in this phase of cooperation, Gaddafi remained difficult to trust, impossible to predict, and unwilling to fully conform. Before we get back to the video, I've got to tell you about something that's been a total game changer for me, especially when it comes to streaming, browsing, and keeping my data safe: Private Internet Access VPN. If you're like me, and you love watching movies, shows, or live sports, you know how frustrating it is when certain content is blocked in your country. Not to worry, with private internet access, you can connect to servers in 91 countries and all 50 US states, which means you can unlock region-restricted content on Netflix, Disney+, Amazon Prime, you name it. With private internet access, I was able to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, one of my favorite movies, which isn't even available on Netflix in Nigeria, simply by changing my location to Japan. But here's the thing: private internet access isn't just about streaming. It's about security. It hides your IP address, encrypts your connection, and keeps your personal data safe from hackers, internet service providers, and even government snooping. I really like that it works on Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, and Linux, basically any device, and one subscription covers unlimited devices. And the best part? You can try it risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24-hour customer support. Right now, you can grab it for 83% off. That's just a couple of dollars a month, and you'll get 4 extra months for free. Just click my link in the description and pinned comment below, or scan the QR code on screen and take control of your online freedom with private internet access. Now let's get back to the video. By the twilight years of the 20th century, Gaddafi's vision of Arab unity, a dream he had spent decades financing and championing, was dead. The Arab world had abandoned him and, in his eyes, betrayed Libya. You see, not one Arab state came to Libya's defense when the international embargo crippled its economy after the Lockerbie bombing fallout. He no longer saw Libya as part of the Arab Middle East. Instead, he turned southward, pivoting his ideology and identity toward Africa. Between 1997 and 2000, Gaddafi launched a full-scale diplomatic and financial push across sub-Saharan Africa. Libya signed bilateral aid and cooperation agreements with 10 African states, joining the Community of Sahel-Saharan States in 1998. Although this aid was often wrapped in political strings and symbolic gestures, it came at a time when many African nations were desperate for alternatives to conditional Western loans and World Bank austerity. In July 2000, Gaddafi was welcomed back into the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, the continental body he had long treated with contempt. From that point on, the OAU would become his new pet project, into which he injected enormous sums of money and ambition. Gaddafi became instrumental in transforming the outdated OAU into the more robust African Union, formally launched in 2002. Gaddafi envisioned the African Union as a federal superstate, a single African nation under one flag. At the 2005 AU summit in Tripoli, the Libyan leader escalated his campaign for deeper integration, proposing the creation of a single African currency, which he named the Afro, alongside a continental passport to ease movement across borders. He also envisioned the merger of national armies into a unified African military, serving as the continent's joint defense force. At the core of it all was his dream of a centralized African government modeled after the United States of America. But most African leaders remained skeptical, viewing it as nothing more than Gaddafi's ploy to place himself at the helm of a new African superstate. Nonetheless, Gaddafi pressed on. Now seen as a messianic figure and unifier of the continent, the Libyan leader often played a pragmatic role as peacemaker. In April 1999, Gaddafi mediated in the conflict between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, going so far as to deploy Libyan troops to help uphold the ceasefire agreement. He was also credited by the African Union for his efforts to resolve the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict, despite having previously fueled tensions in the region. In addition, he became deeply involved in trying to settle the civil war in Sudan, a catastrophic conflict that had already claimed over 200,000 lives. But Gaddafi's turn toward peace with the West, his renunciation of terrorism, dismantling of Libya's weapons programs, and rekindling of diplomatic ties was not enough to heal the deep wounds left by decades of repression. Beneath the surface of international praise and oil-fueled partnerships, ordinary Libyans remained trapped in poverty, joblessness, and political suffocation. While European leaders shook Gaddafi's hand and signed lucrative deals, Libyans endured censorship, corruption, and a regime that promised reform but delivered fear. So when the first sparks of revolution ignited in neighboring Tunisia, it wasn't foreign policy that would define Gaddafi's fate. It was the voices of his own people, rising after 40 years of silence. On the morning of 17th of December 2010, in the dusty town of Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, a young street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi reached a breaking point. Humiliated and frustrated after local police confiscated his unlicensed fruit cart, his only means of survival, Bouazizi drenched himself in fuel and set himself on fire outside the governor's office. His body, engulfed in flames, became the first spark of what would soon set much of the Arab world ablaze. 17 days later, Bouazizi died from his burns, but his final act of protest resonated far beyond his small town. Across Tunisia, people took to the streets. They weren't just mourning Bouazizi, they were rising against the suffocating mix of rampant corruption, economic despair, high unemployment, inflated food prices, and authoritarian repression that plagued much of the region. By mid-January 2011, the uprising had achieved what had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. President El Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled Tunisia with an iron grip for 23 years, was forced to flee the country. This moment electrified the Arab world. Across the region, millions saw the unthinkable unfold. A dictator brought down not by foreign armies or elite coups, but by ordinary people demanding dignity. In Egypt, mass protests broke out on 25th of January 2011, directly inspired by the revolution in Tunisia. In a matter of 18 days, President Hosni Mubarak, one of the longest-serving leaders in the Middle East, was forced to resign. He was later arrested and put on trial for the murder of protesters during the unrest. Meanwhile, in Libya, Gaddafi viewed these revolts through a lens of denial and delusion. As unrest began to stir in his own country, he stood by his fellow autocrat Ben Ali. In a televised address, he said he was pained by the events in Tunisia and blamed the uprising on foreign meddling, particularly the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that had exposed the corruption in Ben Ali's regime. Rather than acknowledge the people's grievances, Gaddafi recommended that Ben Ali be reinstated and went so far as to propose that Tunisia adopt Libya's system of government. Behind this public bravado, however, was real anxiety. Tunisia's revolution had terrified the aging strongmen of the region. Gaddafi feared that Libya could be next. In a preemptive move, the regime cut customs duties and slashed food prices in mid-January 2011, hoping to quiet any unrest. It was a shallow fix for deeper wounds. Days later, protests broke out across Libya, in Tripoli, Benghazi, Bani Walid, and Al-Baida, with demands ranging from better housing to calls for dignity and justice. These protests quickly escalated. Accusing the regime of incompetence and corruption, protesters occupied hundreds of unfinished housing units and attacked the offices of foreign contractors. Gaddafi, sensing the danger of a divided military, swiftly purged senior officers, fearing that the Libyan armed forces could fracture like those in Tunisia. Then came the arrest of Fathi Tarbel, a human rights lawyer representing the families of victims from the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where hundreds of prisoners were slaughtered by Gaddafi's regime. His arrest triggered fierce protests in Benghazi, which quickly spread to other neighboring regions. Meanwhile, the regime made a failed attempt to block Facebook and Twitter, platforms that had become powerful tools for organizing the protests. By now, it was clear that this was not a passing storm. On the 17th of February 2011, the military began opening fire on protesters, killing at least 50 people in Benghazi. The next day, as mourners left a funeral, security forces opened fire, pushing the death toll past 100. Following this, Gaddafi took to state television. Standing in front of the bombed-out Tripoli building hit by U.S. warplanes in 1986, now adorned with a sculpture of a crushed American jet, he denounced the protesters as terrorists and drug addicts under al-Qaeda influence and vowed never to leave Libya, even if it meant death. In another televised rant, he threatened to hunt the rebels down street by street, house by house, wardrobe by wardrobe. The effect was immediate. Rather than suppress the rebellion, Gaddafi's words and actions deepened the rift. Soon, some of his high-ranking officials began to defect. Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil and General Abdel Fattah Yunus, along with several top diplomats, defected to join the revolution. By the end of February, eastern cities like Benghazi, Misrata, Al-Baida, and Tobruk were under rebel control. To legitimize the opposition, the rebel leaders formed the National Transitional Council, the NTC, in February 2011. Led by Mustafa Abdul Jalil, the council pledged to unify the country and liberate Tripoli. By July, they were recognized by more than 30 governments as Libya's legitimate authority. Gaddafi dismissed these recognitions as worthless, urging his followers to trample on them. But momentum was no longer on his side. Meanwhile, the international community began to weigh in on the matter, condemning the violence and demanding accountability. On the 26th of February, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1970, suspending Libya from the Human Rights Council, imposing sanctions, and referring Gaddafi and his son to the International Criminal Court for the killing of unarmed civilians. Additionally, the UN imposed a no-fly zone on the country, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO, supported by the Arab League, began enforcing the no-fly zone, and countries like Qatar and the UAE committed planes to the effort. Nowhere was the cost of the war more evident than in Misrata. The city endured weeks of shelling, food shortages, and medical collapse. Gaddafi's forces tried to suffocate the resistance by cutting off supplies. Despite NATO airstrikes that destroyed tanks and weapons, the siege dragged on. Gaddafi's forces adapted, ditching tanks for jeeps and hiding in civilian areas to evade aerial detection. By early summer, his forces could no longer mount sustained offensives. Furthermore, his longtime allies and friends had abandoned him. Italy, once one of his closest partners under Prime Minister Berlusconi, opened its southern bases to NATO airstrikes targeting his regime. In a powerful joint letter published in the London Times, US President Barack Obama, British Prime Minister David Cameron, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy declared that Libya had no future as long as Gaddafi remained in power. August 2011 marked the final unraveling. With NATO air support and growing rebel alliances, including support from the long-marginalized Berber communities, the rebel militias surged westward. They captured the city of Zliten and, after fierce battles, advanced into the capital, Tripoli. Gaddafi tried to save himself by offering to negotiate a transitional government, but the rebels refused outright. Thereafter, he fled to Sirte to regroup. There, he mourned the death of his son Kamis, killed in a NATO airstrike, and continued sending audio messages through Syria-based RI TV. By October, Gaddafi was a fugitive, constantly moving with a shrinking entourage, including his son Mutassim, Defense Minister Abu Bakr Yunus Jaber, and Security Chief Mansour Dow. He hid in abandoned buildings, praying and reading the Quran. On the 20th of October, Gaddafi attempted to break out of Sirte with a joint civilian and military convoy. But unfortunately for him, NATO jets struck the convoy near the Jaref Valley, killing 53 people. Gaddafi fled to a villa, then to a construction site, and finally into a drainage pipe. Soon, the rebels found him. In the chaos, Gaddafi was injured. Graphic footage showed him captured alive but bloodied and likely tortured. He was loaded into an ambulance, and by the time he reached Misrata, he was dead. Officially, the NTC claimed he died in a crossfire, but eyewitnesses reported that he was executed. His body, along with those of his son Mutassim and Defense Minister Jaber, was put on public display in a meat freezer for 4 days. Then, without ceremony, all three were buried in a secret desert location. Gaddafi's death marked the end of an era, but not the beginning of peace. In the years that followed, Libya descended into political chaos and violent fragmentation. Rival governments, tribal militias, extremist groups, and foreign powers have all vied for control, turning the country into a battleground.